Hello everyone and welcome back to the Dungeon Learner's Guide. This week we've got another Commander's Guild deck tech. This is our 90th deck and it's titled Karona Backgrounds. And if you haven't seen the show before, what we're doing is randomly selecting a card from scryfall.com, working with a budget of $100 or less, and building a commander deck for Magic the Gathering around a theme of the chosen card. So very quickly, before we get into the deck tech itself, I want to take a second, highlight some of our social media accounts and some ways that you can help support the channel if that's something you're interested in doing. So first up, you can follow us on Twitter at 13POYNZ, find us on Reddit, u/POYNZ13, send us an email at dungeonlearnersguide@gmail.com. All three of those are great ways to reach out to us if you ever have any questions, want to suggest some cards that you'd like to see turned into decks, or just have a conversation. They're all perfect ways to do that. And if you're looking to support the channel a little bit more directly, you can head on over to our TCG Player affiliate link, which is in the description of the video. Once you get there, any cards you purchase, we get a little bit of kickback from as a thank you for sending you their way. And then finally, the most direct way, and the way that's going to give you the most benefits, is patreon.com/dungeonlearnersguide. Over there, you get access to things like a Discord channel where we actually brew up some of the decks and where I look for people to play in the game. So if you've ever wanted to be in a game on this channel, that is a great way to do that. You get access to the deck lists a week early. You get access to the unedited gameplay videos so you can hear the players' commentary and talking with each other rather than just my own commentary over the actual game itself. And of course, you also get access to one card sent to you every single month, one of our random cards. So if that is something you are interested in, you can check us out over on Patreon. And I do have to shout out our 4 current patrons. We have William Swiftfoot, we've got Doodle, we've got Calvin Schmidt, and Eric Hui. So to the 4 of you, thank you all so very much for all that you do to help support this channel. And if none of that is your style, you can always just like the video, subscribe to the channel. That does help out quite a bit. But I think I'm done rambling about all of that, so let's take a look at our random card of the week, which was actually suggested to us by one of our patrons, Eric Hui, and this one is going to be Karona False God. So Karona False God is 1 white, blue, black, red, green for a 5/5 legend. It has been changed, so it is now an avatar. That is very relevant because its abilities are haste, and at the beginning of each player's upkeep, that player untaps Karona False God and gains control of it. And whenever Karona attacks, creatures of the type of your choice get +3/+3 until end of turn. So the fact that she's an avatar is incredibly important because you can name avatar with Karona's own ability, giving her +3/+3 and attacking as an 8/8 rather than just 5/5. Now, a bit of an unspoken rule on the channel is that if we get a legendary creature as our random card, it is, of course, also going to be our commander, because what better way to build around a creature than to make it the commander? So if we can, we will. And what that means for us with this deck, though, is I wanted to find a way to make good use of everything that Karona does, because getting Karona as our random card means that we can kind of do anything we want. We're a 5-color deck. We can do pretty much anything, but if we're building around Karona herself, it kind of limits what we want to do. So there's a couple of things that we did, and we're going to take a look at the themes and I'll explain them. But the first one is going to be by far the most important for what we're doing, and you may have guessed this from the title, but this is a backgrounds deck. So in the most recent Commander Legends, there were a ton of background cards that were created, which were legendary enchantments. And the key wording on these cards is that it says commander creatures you own have, and then it has some form of text that it then gives to the creature. So for example, Agent of the Shadow Thieves is 1 and a black for a legendary enchantment background. Commander creatures you own have. Whenever this creature attacks a player, if no opponent has more life than that player, put a +1/+1 counter on this creature. It gains Death Touch and Indestructible until the end of turn. So if everybody's at 40 life, we attack an opponent, no opponent has more life than that player, so Karona gets a +1/+1 counter, Death Touch, and Indestructible until the end of turn. Now, the reason that Karona lends herself very well to a background deck is because of the very specific wording on things like Agent of the Shadow Thieves. When it says commander creatures you own have this ability, it means that when we give Karona away because of her own ability, she will keep all of the things that are given to her by the backgrounds. We do not have to control Karona for her to have those abilities. So we can give it to the next person in line, And then when they attack an opponent who has no less life than any other opponent, then they will get a +1/+1 counter on Karona, give her Death Touch, and Indestructible. So we can kind of pass an absolute monstrosity of a creature around the board that's nearly impossible to kill, that's doing a ton of damage, and starting to knock people out of the game very, very quickly because of commander damage. And so that leads us to our second theme, which is if we're passing around this absolute beast of a creature, we need to make sure she doesn't attack us. So that's where we have cards like Vow of Flight, which is 2 and a blue for an enchantment aura, enchant creature. Enchanted creature gets +2/+2, has flying, and can't attack you or a planeswalker you control. So most of the time in a game of Commander, you want to put these kinds of cards on your opponent's creatures. Make sure that they can't attack you. But we actually want to be putting this on our own commander, because if we can put Vow of Flight onto Karona, then we can make sure that Karona not only is attacking as it goes around the table, but it will never attack us. And it's attacking as a base 7/7 with flying. That means that it's very difficult for our opponents to not want to attack with it, because they can start knocking each other out very quickly, but we can make sure that they never get to attack us with our own commander. And then you may have noticed, since our two major themes here are both enchantments, that leads us to our last theme, which is Enchantress. Because if we're playing a ton of backgrounds, which are enchantments, we're playing a ton of auras, which are enchantments, then we might as well be playing cards like Sithis Harvest's Hand, which is a green and a white, for a 1/2 legendary enchantment creature, Nymph. Whenever you cast an enchantment spell, you gain a life and draw a card. Since the vast majority of our deck is going to be filled with enchantments, we might as well try to find ways to take advantage of that. And one of the best ways are cards that let us draw cards whenever we play an enchantment, basically being able to replace itself in our hand. So if we get multiple of these on the board at one time, we can then start casting multiple enchantments a turn, drawing multiple cards every time we cast an enchantment, and just kind of getting out of hand for our opponents. So that is our major game plan. We kind of want to just use Karona as, well, I mean, a literal win condition. We want her to be able to run around the board, knock everybody else out, and not be able to attack us while we sit there and draw cards from it. So those are our themes for the deck. But let's take a quick look at some key cards, cards that, while they may not necessarily be win conditions in their own right, they are very powerful and help push us to eventually winning the game. The first of those key cards is going to be Assault Suit. Now, Assault Suit is 4 mana for an artifact equipment. Equipped creature gets +2/+2, has haste, can't attack you or a planeswalker you control, and can't be sacrificed. At the beginning of each opponent's upkeep, you may have that player gain control of equipped creature until the end of turn. If you do, untap it and equip for 3. Now, that second line of text doesn't really do much for us because Karona is already being passed around, but the first line does. And the most important set of words on this card is that it can't be sacrificed. One of the worst things that we could have happen to us in this deck is we pass Karona around the board and someone just casts a Village Rites, sacrifices our commander so that they can draw some cards, or sacrifices it to make mana, or does any other number of things to kill our commander without actually trying to kill the commander. So with Assault Suit, we guarantee that it can't attack us, which is already great, and it can't be sacrificed, so our opponents can't get rid of it without spending a normal removal spell, which hopefully we'll have ways to protect it from. So Assault Suit is very, very relevant in this deck because it's one of the biggest ways to protect our win condition, even if it itself is not a win condition. And then that brings us to our second key card, which is going to be Sphere of Safety. Another big way to make sure that we are not getting attacked is cards like Ghostly Prison, Propaganda, cards that say our opponents have to pay a certain amount of mana to attack us. Sphere of Safety is like the ultimate of those cards. Because it is 4 and a white for an enchantment, creatures can't attack you or a planeswalker you control unless their controller pays X for each of those creatures, where X is the number of enchantments you control. Because we're going to have so many auras, we're going to have so many backgrounds, we should have a ton of enchantments in play at any given time. And even if we only have, say, 5 enchantments in play, that means each opponent has to pay 5 mana to attack us with a single creature. At some point, the amount of mana they've got to spend to attack us is just not worth it when they can attack someone else for free. So that is another great way for us to prevent Karona from attacking us, and even more so than just Karona, it prevents pretty much anything from attacking us. If one of our opponents is a token style strategy where they want to make just a billion tokens, they're just never going to really be able to attack us except for maybe 1 or 2 damage a turn, which is not nearly going to be enough to stop us. So that is key card number 2. And key card number 3 is going to be Raised by Giants. Of course, we got to have a background in here. They're super important to our strategy. And I think the best one for this deck is Raised by Giants because it is 5 and a green for a legendary enchantment background. Commander creatures you own have base power and toughness 10/10 and are giants in addition to their other types. So all we've got to do is have Karona and Raised by Giants, and Karona will now start two-shotting anyone at the table with commander damage because she's a 10/10 that can give herself +3/+3, meaning that if she hits someone twice, they've taken 26 commander damage and they are just dead. They're gone, they're out of the game. So Raised by Giants turns our 3-shotting Karona, who is an 8/8 if she's naming Avatar by herself, into a 2-shot, which is much, much quicker in a game of Commander, especially when you're passing her around the table. Because if I hit a player and then I pass Karonas to the next player and they hit the same player, they're dead before it even gets to their turn. So Raised by Giants and Karona can start knocking players out of the game very, very quickly and is an incredibly powerful combination, especially with what we are trying to do. But those are all of our key cards, and the next thing that I want to talk about in this deck tech is some cool interactions, some cards that synergize very well together and work well together. Now, I'm not going to lie to you, I had to stretch a bit to get a couple of these cool interactions because there's so many backgrounds and auras in here that don't really synergize with each other, and I don't want to talk more about enchantresses because we know those work super well with our enchantments. So instead, we're going to take a look at some more niche interactions. The first of which is going to be through Clan Crafter and Shiny Impetus, 2 cards that don't automatically look like they work well together, but let me explain. So Clan Crafter is 1 and a blue for a legendary enchantment background. Commander creatures you own have pay 2, sacrifice an artifact, put a +1/+1 counter on this creature, and draw a card. Shiny Impetus is 3 and a red for an enchantment aura, enchant creature, and enchanted creature gets +2/+2 and is goaded. Whenever enchanted creature attacks, you create a treasure token. So these work very well just on their own because they're phenomenal cards, but what we want to do is put Shiny Impetus on Karona, meaning it has to attack, and every time it attacks, we are going to make a treasure token. So we attack with Karona, the next person in line attacks with Karona, the 3rd player and the 4th player all attack with Karona. That's giving us 4 treasures every single time it goes around the table. Clan Crafter means that we can spend 2 of those treasures to activate its ability, sacrifice a 3rd treasure to put a +1/+1 counter onto Karona and draw a card, leaving us still with 1 treasure left over. So with these 2 cards, not only are we ramping with our treasures, but we can literally have an extra treasure and draw a card and put a +1/+1 counter on Karona every single go around the table. So every single turn we are getting to do this, and once we've got that going, we're going to be able to keep casting backgrounds, we're going to be able to keep casting auras and other things that we need to protect Karona, and we're going to get out of hand very, very quickly. So these 2, while they look kind of innocent, and I think in most decks they would be, this wouldn't be a combination that would be super powerful in most decks, but because Karona can be attacking from every single player's perspective, that makes Shiny Impetus and Clan Crafter significantly better. But that is only cool interaction number 1. The next one that we're going to take a look at is going to be between Cloakwood Hermit and Street Urchin. So Cloakwood Hermit, 2 and a green for a legendary enchantment background. Commander creatures you own have, at the beginning of your end step, if a creature card was put into your graveyard from anywhere this turn, create 2 tapped 1/1 green squirrel creature tokens. And if we combine that up with Street Urchin, which is 1 and a red for a legendary enchantment background, commander creatures you own have pay 1, sacrifice another creature or an artifact. This creature deals 1 damage to any target. So this is more of a long-term value engine. This isn't going to be something that's going to get you a ton of value right away, but what you can do is you sacrifice a creature with Street Urchin, then at the end of your turn you make 2 1/1 squirrels. On your next turn, you can use one of those squirrels to sacrifice the street urchin, doing 1 damage to anything. And then at the end of your turn, you make 2 more squirrels. So every single turn, you're gaining an additional squirrel and being able to do an extra damage to any target that you want. So over the course of the game, this could let you do a ton of damage and get you a ton of squirrels, which again might not necessarily win you the game, but you've got to keep in mind too that the squirrels are great ways to prevent your opponents from attacking you. Because if you can just throw a 1/1 squirrel in front of Karona, why would they attack you when they could attack someone else? So this is a great protective option. But it's also a great way to use Street Urchin to shoot down your opponent's squirrels if you give them Karona and they're able to make squirrels too. So a very relevant set of cards just on their own, but combined they just kind of have this long-term value that makes it hard for people to stop Karona. But that is the vast majority of the deck. So obviously, since we're talking about budget, we got to talk about what the actual budget is of this deck. And overall, the deck came out to $69.14. So a very, well, not very good, but pretty good budget for the deck. And the weird part about this deck is that most of the cards kind of floated around the $4 to $5 range. So our most expensive card is actually Karona False God herself at $4.39. Now, obviously, this whole deck runs around the commander, so it's hard to argue that you could cut the commander. So the second most expensive card in the entire deck is going to be Propaganda. And Propaganda is 2 and a blue for an enchantment. Creatures can't attack you unless their controller pays 2 mana for each creature they control that is attacking you. This is $4.18. So not a lot cheaper than Karona, but it's relevant enough for this deck, because if you were to cut out Propaganda, you go from $69.14 to about $65, roughly. So Propaganda is very good, and it's a great way to prevent our opponents from attacking us, which is what we want to be doing. But if you do need to cut it for budget reasons, it is kind of an easy cut because we have a lot of other cards that do very similar things. And as weird as it is, the Vow Cycle is kind of just better than Propaganda because we're not really worried about our opponents attacking us with their creatures. We're worried about Karona because Karona is going to do a ton of damage very, very quickly, and we need to make sure we're not taking that damage. We really don't want to die to our own commander in this game. That is like goal number 1. So if you need to cut Propaganda to cut the price of the deck down, you certainly can. However, on the other hand, if you're looking to increase the price of the deck or add some cards that I think should be in here, but that I wasn't able to fit into the budget, I do have a suggestion for you there as well. Now, I will be upfront, this card could fit into the current budget of the deck, but I wanted to leave it out just because I like sometimes having the cheaper options for the decks. But the card that I would recommend including if you could, and what I would take out, would be Gisela Blade of Gold Knight for Cultist of the Absolute. So Gisela Blade of Gold Knight is 4 red, white, white, so a massive 7 mana for a 5/5 legendary creature angel. She has flying, first strike. If a source would deal damage to an opponent or a permanent an opponent controls, that source deals double that damage to that player or permanent instead. And if a source would deal damage to you or a permanent you control, prevent half that damage rounded up. Gisela is an absolute monster of a creature in Commander because all of a sudden you're doing double the damage to 3 separate opponents. All of those opponents are doing double the damage to each other, but everyone's doing half damage to you, and that really disincentivizes attacking you. People don't want to attack you with their big 10/10 if they're only going to do 5 damage. They would much rather attack someone else with their big 10/10 knowing it can do 20 damage. So this really helps us prevent attacks coming our way. But the nice thing about Gisela in this deck is that she cares about things that are controlled by our opponents. So if we send Karona around the table and Karona is attacking us, Karona will do half damage to us, but will do double the damage to our opponents. And that's incredibly relevant because, again, we don't want to be attacked by Karona, but we want Karona to be attacking other people. Gisela does a great job of convincing the table that that's what they should be doing. And so, to add in Gisela, I would recommend taking out Cultist of the Absolute. And Cultist of the Absolute is a very good card, and I think that there are decks that it can be very good in, but after a little bit of playtesting with this deck, unfortunately, I don't think it's this one. So Cultist of the Absolute is 1 black mana for a legendary enchantment background. Commander creatures you own get +3/+3 and have flying, death touch, ward, pay 3 life, and at the beginning of your upkeep, sacrifice a creature. So initially, this looked really good. In my opinion, I was like, oh, our opponents are going to be sacrificing their creatures, plus Karona's going to get wards, she's going to have flying, she's going to get death touch, and +3/+3. But I wasn't paying close enough attention because of the wording at the beginning of your upkeep, sacrifice a creature. It doesn't say another creature, which means that our opponents can just straight up sacrifice Karona to Cultist of the Absolute. That is not what we want to see happening. So unfortunately, Cultist of the Absolute kind of works as a removal spell for our own commander in this deck, which is not what we want at all. So I would highly recommend that if you're able to swap out Gisela for the Cultist of the Absolute, that would probably improve the deck a little bit. And Cultist of the Absolute is, like I said, a very good card, but unfortunately, this is not the deck for that. All right, so now that I think we've talked about the deck enough, let's actually see how this deck performs in a game. And more specifically, we're going to see how this deck performs in 2 separate games. There's a bit of a reason for that, which we will get into later, but for right now, let's talk about game number 1, where we are going to be joined by 3 opponents. And this week, we are going to be joined by Nina, who is playing her Bane Lord of Darkness deck, Mike playing Alesha, who smiles at death, and Jacob from Opal Wave playing Mina and Den Wildborn. So Nina's Bane deck is almost a Dungeons & Dragons themed deck. She has a lot of initiative cards and adventure cards, and cards that were printed in Legends of Baldur's Gate and the original Adventures in the Forgotten Realms, and it's kind of just like themed around Dungeons & Dragons, which is super, super cool. And it's also pretty aggressive for an Esper deck. You normally don't expect the Esper deck at the table to be the aggressive style, but she does a great job of sending her creatures in and doing tons of damage. So I am looking forward to this one. I'm hoping that if we can kind of give her Karona, she'll be very incentivized to attack other people as a thank you. So we'll see how that goes. Next up is Mike, and just being up front, Mike's Alesha deck is by far the one I am the most scared about at this table. I have lost to Mike's Alesha deck quite a few times in the past. It is very impressive. It's very fast. He does a great job of accruing value and triggering infinite combos and just getting a ton of creatures back from the graveyard very, very quickly that have no business being in play as early as he can get them. So I am worried about Alesha, and I think one of the things that worries me the most is that a lot of our things that prevent people from attacking us, like say propaganda, those don't affect the creatures that Alesha is going to put into play because they enter the battlefield already attacking. They can kind of get around our tax effects and still attack us through that. So something that could stop them from attacking isn't going to save us from Alesha. So I do think that's one of the big reasons why Alesha is my personal biggest concern at the table. And then finally, we have Jacob playing Mina and Den Wildborn, which is a deck he's played on this channel before. Unfortunately, he didn't quite get it to go off last time, so he wanted to give it another shot. This is a Gruul Super Friends deck, so he wants to play as many Planeswalkers as possible and kind of use various token strategies and +1/+1 counter strategies, or I suppose not +1/+1. It'd be loyalty counters for commanders, so that want to proliferate and add extra counters to his Planeswalkers, and just make sure that he's getting a ton of value and kind of overwhelming his opponents with that level of value. Plus, I imagine a lot of green Planeswalkers are very good at ramp, so that's probably also another thing he's got going on. So I am very excited for this deck. I think the commanders we're going to be playing against are super sweet. I'm very excited to see how Karona works, but let me know what you all think. Like the video, subscribe to the channel if you like it, and I will talk to you all once the game is done. At the start of the game, I go first, followed by Nina, Mike, and then Jacob. On my first turn, I play a Seagate, naming green so that it taps for blue or green mana. Nina plays a Swamp. Mike plays a Swamp and casts Claws of Gix, letting him sacrifice a permanent to gain a life, then also casts Jeweled Lotus, immediately sacrificing it to make 3 red mana and casting his commander, Alesha, who smiles at death. Jacob plays a Windswept Heath. I play a Maze's End, and then at the end of my turn, Jacob sacrifices Windswept Heath to search his library for a Sheltered Thicket, putting it into play. Nina plays an island and casts Zentarum Bandit, letting her pay a life when she attacks to make a treasure token. Mike plays a Sunbaked Canyon and then attacks Jacob for 3 with Alesha. Then in his second main phase, he casts Rixmati Reveler, discarding a card and drawing a card, notably putting Master of Cruelties into the graveyard. On Jacob's turn, he plays a Rootbound Crag and passes. I play a Command Tower and cast Propaganda, making each opponent pay 2 mana to attack me. Nina plays a Plains. Mike plays a Mountain, and then attacks Nina for 3 with Alesha, paying 2 mana to return Master of Cruelties from his graveyard to play, attacking me, getting around my Propaganda. Since I can't block the demon, its ability activates, putting me down to 1 life. Jacob plays a Mountain, and then casts Reclamation Sage, destroying Mike's Claws of Gix, but before it's gone, he uses it to sacrifice Master of Cruelties, gaining a life. On my turn, I cast Rampant Growth, searching my library for a basic land and putting it into play tapped. Nina plays an island and casts Aarakocra Sneak, gaining the initiative and searching her library for a basic land, putting it into her hand. Mike plays a Plains and casts Path to Exile, exiling Jacob's Reclamation Sage, but letting him search his library for a basic land, putting it into play tapped. This allows him to attack Jacob for 2 with the Reveler, and Nina for 3 with Alesha, activating her ability and returning Master of Cruelties to the battlefield tapped and attacking. Since the demon can't be blocked, Jacob goes to 1 life and then takes 2 damage from the Reveler, knocking him out of the game, while Nina blocks with her Sneak, taking no damage. On my turn, I play a Citadel Gate, naming black so it taps for white or black, and then cast Shiny Impetus on Alesha, giving her +2/+2, goading her and letting me make a treasure token whenever she attacks. In Nina's upkeep, the initiative triggers, letting her put 2 +1/+1 counters on Aarakocra Sneak. Then she plays a Swamp and casts Rilsa Rael Kingpin, taking the initiative, making me lose 5 life and knocking me out of the game. Then she attacks Mike for 3 in the air with her Sneak, and passes. Mike plays a Plains and casts Key to the City, letting him discard a card to make a creature unblockable and also pay 2 mana when the key untaps to draw a card. He immediately activates the key, discarding Avalanche Riders to make Master of Cruelties unblockable. This lets him attack Nina with the Master of Cruelties, putting her down to 1 life, but notably lets her keep the initiative since the demon doesn't deal combat damage. In Nina's upkeep, the initiative triggers, letting her draw a card, then she plays a Swamp, and casts Cone of Cold, rolling a d20 and tapping all creatures Mike controls, preventing them from untapping if she rolls a 10 or higher. But, unfortunately, Mike counters the spell with a red Elemental Blast, allowing him to untap, activate the Key to the City, making Alesha unblockable, and knock Nina out, winning Mike the game. Alright, so game 1, a little bit short. Mike did a very good job of kind of running us over, but we will talk a little bit more about that once we get to the end and we talk about the wrap-up. So the same crew is going to be joining us for game 2. Still going to be Nina, still playing Bane, still going to be Jacob playing Mina and Den, but Mike decided to swap from Alesha to Yidris, and we figured since the first game was so short, we'd at least get a second go of it. So probably don't need to talk about Mina and Den and Bane, same thing as before. But however, we will mention Mike's Yidris deck, which Mike always finds a way to bring a deck that I am most afraid of, and I am the most afraid of his Yidris deck, because Yidris is an extra turns deck. He wants to take as many extra turns as possible and just make sure that he's the only one who's really playing the game, and then he can kind of beat people down with Yidris, which is a 5 power legendary creature in his command zone, so that's a bit of a concern from our end. But I think that we'll be able to do a pretty good job here. I think hopefully we can kind of stop Mike from taking his extra turns because of Karona, or if he does take a ton of extra turns and has Karona, then we can at least use that to kind of start knocking people out as well. So we'll see how game number 2 goes. Hope you all enjoy it, and I will talk to you all once it's done. At the start of the game, Jacob goes first, followed by myself, Nina, and then Mike. On Jacob's first turn, he plays a forest and casts an expedition map. I play a command tower, Nina plays an island. Mike plays an island. Jacob plays a ghost quarter and then sacrifices Expedition Map to search his library for a command tower, putting it into his hand. On my turn, I play a Basilisk Gate and cast Agent of the Shadow Thieves, giving Karona the ability to get a +1/+1 counter, indestructible, and death touch whenever she attacks an opponent without the lowest life total. Nina plays a Swamp and casts Zentarum Bandit, letting her pay a life whenever she attacks to make a treasure token. Mike plays a Mountain. Jacob plays a command tower and casts Growing Rites of Itlimoc, looking at the top 7 cards of his library and putting a creature from among them into his hand, choosing Birds of Paradise. I play a Plains and cast Mesa Enchantress, letting me draw a card whenever I cast an enchantment. Nina plays a Plains and attacks Mike for 2, paying a life to make a treasure token. Then, at the end of turn, Mike casts Mystical Tutor, searching his library for an instant or sorcery, putting it on top of his library. This lets him put Brainstorm on top of his deck, and then, when he draws it for turn, he casts the Brainstorm, drawing 3 cards and putting 2 cards from his hand back on top of his library. After that, he plays a Breeding Pool tapped and passes. Jacob plays a Windswept Heath, sacrificing it to search his library for a Stomping Ground, putting it into play untapped, losing 2 life. He then casts Xenagos the Reveler, and activates Xenagos' 0 ability to create a 2/2 Satyr token. I play a Forest and cast Rampant Growth, searching my library for a basic land, putting it into play tapped. I then cast Guild Artisan, drawing a card and giving Karona the ability to create 2 treasure tokens whenever she attacks an opponent without the lowest life total. Nina plays an island and casts Hammers of Moradin, which has Myriad and taps an opponent's creature when it attacks that player. She then attacks Mike for 2, paying a life and making another treasure token. When Mike draws for turn, he reveals Temporal Mastery, paying its miracle cost to take an extra turn after this one. Unfortunately, he doesn't find a land drop, so he passes to himself, casts a Relic of Legends, and then passes to Jacob. Jacob casts Birds of Paradise, and also casts Llanowar Elves before activating Xenagos' +1 ability, making 3 red mana since he controls 3 creatures. This allows him to cast his commander, Mina and Den Wildborn, letting him play an additional land on each of his turns. Then at the end of turn, since Jacob has 4 creatures, the Growing Rites transforms into Itlimoc Cradle of the Sun, which can tap for green mana equal to the number of creatures he controls. On my turn, I cast Candlekeep Sage, drawing a card and letting me draw a card whenever Karona enters or leaves the battlefield. I also cast Folk Hero, drawing a card and giving Karona the ability to draw me a card when I cast a creature that shares a creature type with her. Then I play a Seagate naming Black so that it can tap for either green or black mana. Nina plays a Swamp and casts Displacer Kitten, giving her the ability to exile a non-land permanent she controls and return it to the battlefield whenever she casts a non-creature spell. She then attacks Mike for 5, paying a life to create a treasure token and also making 2 copies of the Hammers of Moradin, tapping my Enchantress and Jacob's commander, hitting us both for 3 damage. Then at the end of combat, the Myriad tokens are exiled. Mike casts Grapple with the Past, milling 3 cards and returning Jorn, God of Winter, from his graveyard to his hand, also putting Wonder into his graveyard, giving all his creatures flying. Jacob casts Evolution Sage, letting him proliferate when a land enters the battlefield under his control. He then activates Mina and Den to return Command Tower to his hand and replays it, proliferating and putting an additional counter on Xenagos. He then repeats this process, returning Command Tower to hand, replaying it, and proliferating. After that, he casts Repeated Reverberation, allowing him to copy the next instant, sorcery, or planeswalker ability he activates twice. This lets him activate Xenagos' ultimate ability, killing the planeswalker and exiling the top 7 cards of his library, putting any number of lands and or creatures from among them onto the battlefield. Plus, thanks to the reverberation, he gets to do this 3 times, putting all lands and creatures from the top 21 cards of his deck into play, resulting in 4 forests, 2 mountains, Karn's Bastion, Cinderglade, Mosswort Bridge, Wooded Foothills, Sheltered Thicket, and Pure Imaginative Rascal coming into play. Once that's resolved, he casts Rishkar's Expertise, drawing 4 cards, and also casting Arasta of the Endless Web from his hand without paying its mana cost, making him a 1/2 spider with reach whenever an opponent casts an instant or sorcery spell. On my turn, I cast my commander Karona the False God, drawing a card, and when I move to combat, I name Avatar with Karona, giving her +3/+3 until end of turn. Then I attack Nina with Karona, giving her Indestructible, Death Touch, and a +1/+1 counter, while I create 2 treasure tokens, and then Nina takes 9 commander damage. In Nina's upkeep, she gains control of Karona, untapping her, and then plays an island and casts Timora's Invoker. When she moves to combat, she names Dwarf with Karona, giving all her dwarves +3/+3, and then attacks Mike for 6 and me with Karona, triggering her abilities, getting Death Touch, Indestructible, and a +1/+1 counter, making her a 7/7, while Nina makes 2 treasures. She also pays 1 life to make another treasure, and then her Hammer's Myriad ability also triggers, sending an additional dwarf at each opponent, tapping my Enchantress and Jacob's Arasta, doing an extra 6 to me while Jacob blocks with a Satyr token, killing it but taking no damage. In Mike's upkeep, he gains control of Karona, untapping her. He then goes to combat, naming Avatar for Karona, and attacks Jacob, creating 2 treasures, giving her Death Touch, Indestructible, and a +1/+1 counter. To prevent the 11 damage, Jacob blocks with Birds of Paradise, killing it. Then, in his second main phase, Mike casts Karn's Temporal Sundering, returning Mina and Den to Jacob's hand, and also taking an extra turn after this one. This also creates a Spider token for Jacob, thanks to Arasta. On Mike's extra turn, he plays an Overgrown Tomb untapped, losing 2 life, and again attacks Jacob with Karona, naming Avatar, creating 2 treasures, giving her Indestructible, Death Touch, and a +1/+1 counter, but Jacob is able to block with his newly created Spider token, killing it but not taking any damage. Then in Mike's second main phase, he casts Part the Water Veil, taking yet another extra turn after this one and creating another Spider for Jacob. On Mike's second extra turn, he casts a Sword of Feast and Famine, equipping it to Karona, giving her +2/+2 and protection from both green and black. When Mike moves to combat, Jacob sacrifices his Wooded Foothills to search his library for a forest, putting it into play. This allows him to cast Krosan Grip, destroying the Sword of Feast and Famine. Even without the sword, Mike still attacks Jacob, naming Avatar, making 2 treasures, giving Karona Death Touch, Indestructible, and a +1/+1 counter, while Jacob blocks with his Spider token. Then in his second main phase, Mike suspends a Mox Tantalite, and also casts a Ledger Shredder, which connives whenever a player casts their second spell each turn. In Jacob's upkeep, he gains control of Karona, untapping her. He then casts Kamal's Druidic Vow, where X equals 17, letting him look at the top 17 cards of his library and put all lands and legendary permanents from among them onto the battlefield. Once that has resolved, he ends up with Oath of Chandra, Chandra Acolyte of Flame, Nissa Who Shakes the World, Rootbound Crag, 3 Forests, Chandra Torch of Defiance, and Garruk Primal Hunter all coming into play. When the Oath enters, it deals 3 damage to Mesa Enchantress, killing it. Then each land also triggers the Evolution Sage, proliferating 4 times and adding 4 counters to all the Planeswalkers that just entered, which is doubled to 8 thanks to Peer. Finally, all the other cards he looked at go to the graveyard, and then he's able to ultimate Garruk, making 26/6 Worm tokens since he controls 20 lands. He also activates Nissa's +1 ability to untap the Cradle of the Sun, putting 3 +1/+1 counters on it. This allows him to activate Acolyte of Flame's -2 ability and cast Kamal's Druidic Vow from his graveyard, this time for X equals 24, triggering the Ledger Shredder so Mike connives. Then Jacob looks at the top 24 cards of his library, putting all legendary permanents and lands into play, resulting in a ton of things coming into play, but the most important is Domri Raid, which can ultimate instantly, giving Jacob an emblem that gives his creatures double strike, trample, hexproof, and haste. This allows him to attack us all out with his army of worms, knocking us all out of the game, and winning Jacob the game. Alright, so both of those games were super sweet. We didn't get to see too much from Karona, Mina and Den, and Bane in the very first game. A turn 1 Alesha from Mike will probably do that, and the fact that he was able to get Master of Cruelties attacking as early as turn 3 was pretty brutal for the rest of the table. So a very quick sweep by Mike in the first game. The second game, however, much more competitive, and it was super sweet to see a lot of decks go off. Nina's Bane deck really put the aggression on the table very quickly, especially with the Hammers of Moradin, and she's played that card a few times in her Bane deck, and every time I see it, it feels like it just puts in so much work, so I may have to start adding Hammers of Moradin to some of my decks. Mike kind of got stuck on lands. Even though he took a few extra turns, he really wasn't able to capitalize on it because he couldn't find enough lands to actually keep doing things. And honestly, the only reason he was in the game at all toward the end there was because Karona was giving him treasures when he attacked with her. So a little bit weird of a situation to be put in. I think overall our deck did very well, being able to pass Karona around when she had Indestructible and Death Touch and counters and making treasures and all that stuff was super, super sweet. So I was very, very happy with the way that Karona played and the way that Karona turned out. And I think that if we had had maybe just a turn or two more, I think that Karona could have very easily won the game, especially because I had a card in hand that was going to goad Karona, so we weren't going to be getting attacked, but everybody else was. So very sweet showing from Karona. But of course, a little bit overshadowed by Jacob's Gruul Super Friends, which absolutely just went off in that game, and it was super, super cool to watch. He got to ultimate multiple Planeswalkers and made a ton of worms and swung out with everything and was able to cast multiple Kamal's Druidic Vows for, I think it was X equals 17 and X equals 24, which was just absurd to watch. So very, very impressive. And I'm very glad that Jacob did get his deck to go off. He's been trying to get it to go off a few times after coming on the channel. So very sweet to see. And a big props to his victory here. But overall, I hope you all enjoyed the game. Hope you all enjoyed the deck tech. If you did, please do like the video, subscribe to the channel, and I will see you all on the other side of the Dungeon Learner's Guide.